Well, in October, my wife and I went to South Africa for a couple of weeks. And it was really like a trip of a lifetime that I'm sure we'll never forget. I mean, Africa is just it's just so different from the United States. And so one of the things that we saw there on our second day that we were there, we were in a city called Johannesburg, and it's a huge city. And as we were driving through the city on the freeway, there was this billboard on the side of the road that said, "Say no to xenophobia." And I thought, what an odd billboard. And I had to kind of think through, what is xenophobia? I mean, and it's spelled Xenophobia. So it's already kind of a strange word because we don't have a lot of words that begin with the letter X. But it would be good to remember if you're ever playing Scrabble, xenophobia. And so I had to kind of think through, what is xenophobia? Well, xenophobia means fear of the stranger or fear of somebody who is not like you. And so I thought it was odd that they would have a billboard in Johannesburg that says, "Say no to xenophobia." But what I learned after a while of being there and talking with people is that in South Africa, there have been issues of violence breaking out against people who are not from South Africa. Starting in the 1990s, people from other parts of Africa began to come to South Africa for a better life, trying to escape the poverty and violence of their home country, believing that the economic stability of South Africa would be a good place to move to. And so these people were moving into South Africa. Well, as into the 2000s, the people who were from South Africa began to experience higher rates of unemployment, and so they acted out against the people that were coming into their country violently. And I thought it was so interesting because the billboard could have said, "Say no to violence." But in the wisdom of the people that put together that billboard, and this was actually a government program, in their wisdom, they recognized that the root of the problem was a lot deeper than violence, that violence was actually just a symptom of the bigger problem. The bigger problem was xenophobia. We could say that the bigger problem was really fear. And fear is actually the root of a lot of problems in the world that we live in. We live in a world that has a lot of fear. When I was going through the process to be ordained, I had to go and be interviewed by the Board of Ordained Ministry. And I'll never forget that one of the questions that they asked me in my interviews was, "What are you afraid of?" And when I thought about the question, my mind flashed to an experience that I had had when I was between my senior year in high school and my first year in college. I worked with a trail crew in the backcountry of Montana, and we were building a hiking trail. And so I lived in the backcountry for that summer. And there were 6 students and then an adult supervisor. And our adult supervisor had spent a lot of time at a place called Philmont in New Mexico. If you're in scouting, you've probably heard of Philmont. Anybody heard of Philmont? A few of you have. And at Philmont, this huge scouting facility, they have problems with bears. And our guide person, Randy, was talking about all of these different things that had happened at Philmont with bears. And he told us about this kid who had gone to Philmont and for some reason decided it would be a good idea to bring cologne. And so one night before bed, he slathered himself up with cologne, and he got into his tent to go to sleep. And in the middle of the night, a bear got into his tent and grabbed him and dragged him through the forest. And he got really banged up and everything, but the bear did not kill him. The bear dragged him through the forest and then left him there. And so Randy told us this story, and then he yawns and says goodnight. So we get into our tent, and I stayed in that summer. I stayed in a tent with 2 other guys. One guy was from Chicago. His name was Dan, and the other guy was from East Los Angeles. His name was Carlos. And so we got into the tent, and I could not sleep because every little sound that I heard in the forest, I began to overanalyze and think, okay, could that be a bear? Because we were in bear country. And at one point, like a couple hours into the night, Dan, who I guess was also not sleeping, he goes, "What was that?" And I was like, "I don't know what." He goes, "I think I heard a bear." So we just listened as hard as we could, and I swear I heard a and we were all just frozen with fear. And I noticed that Carlos, who's laying next to me, is crying. I mean, this hardened guy from East Los Angeles, he's crying. I'm like, "What's wrong, Carlos?" Carlos said, "I have chapstick in my pocket." "Well, throw it out, you idiot. Don't bring chapstick in here. Didn't you listen to Randy's story?" So Carlos got the chapstick out of his pocket, and he unzipped the tent, and he threw it as hard as he could and zipped the tent back up. And I don't think any of us slept at all that night. Nobody got attacked. We were fine. But in the morning, we got out of the tent, and we were walking around the tent, and I did not see one single bear print. And I noticed that the chapstick was about 5 feet from the tent. I guess Carlos didn't have a very strong arm. And so I went over and I picked up the chapstick. It was unscented chapstick. So this unscented chapstick that was buried in Carlos's pocket, inside of his big, thick sleeping bag, inside of a tent with 3 teenage boys who hadn't showered in 3 weeks, apparently was a great threat to our safety with bears. We were afraid. We were just gripped with fear. And so for me, when the Board of Ordained Ministry asked, "What are you afraid of?" what I said was bears. So what are you afraid of? What scares you? What grips you with fear? I want you actually to find people to talk with. If you're here by yourself, please find other people. If you're with other people, look for somebody who's by themselves, and I want you to talk with each other and share with each other, what are you afraid of? Go. Make sure you look around for people who are not talking to anybody because they're by themselves, and reach out. Okay. So most all of us are afraid of something. We all have fears. Some of us are afraid of having a bad diagnosis with our health. Some of us are afraid of looking foolish in front of other people. They say that the number one fear is the fear of public speaking. Some of us are afraid to speak in front of other people. We have all kinds of things that we are afraid of. And it seems like we are living in a time when there is just more and more things to be afraid of. It seems like every time I wake up in the morning and I look at my news app on my phone, I read about another story to be afraid of. It seems like we may even be living in an era of fear. And I don't know if it's something that is just recent or if it's just always been there and it's just being reported on more. But it just seems like there is a lot of fear in our country and in our state, in our city. There is just so much fear. And the problem with fear is that fear when we are gripped with fear, our ability to think straight gets affected. I mean, the reason why Dan and I and Carlos got so wound up, about some pine needles brushing on our tent was because we were gripped with fear. And what happens when we are gripped with fear is that the rational part of our brain shuts down. Our ability to think straight shuts down, and everything moves into the amygdala, which is the reptilian brain in the center of your brain. And it's the small part of our brain that it is the part that teaches us or tells us to either fight or to flee. It is not the part of our brain that can sort through problems and come up with positive solutions. So in this era of fear, when we're gripped with fear, we tend not to think straight. And when we don't think straight, it's hard for us to act very well. In our passage of Scripture today in Luke, we find Jesus speaking of things which are fearful, dreadful things. He says, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Does it seem like we are living at a time when there is confusion in the nations and that people are fainting from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world? Does it seem like we are living in a time when the powers of the heavens are being shaken? It turns out that if you look in history, every single generation has had people saying, this is what's going on. In every generation, people are seeing these signs in the sun and in the moon and the stars. People are seeing these kinds of things taking place. Is this the time that we will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud? I don't know. It could be. People have thought that for generations. Is this the time? I don't know. But what is important is what Jesus tells us when we see these kinds of things, when we observe these kinds of things, when we live in an era where there is a lot of fear. Jesus wants us to act in a certain way. He says to us, "Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. And that day does not catch you unexpectedly like a trap, for it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth." He tells us to be on guard so that our hearts are not weighed down by what we see. He does not want us to be weighed down by what scares us. He does not want us to be weighed down by distractions from the things that he's asked us to be focused on. He doesn't want us to escape reality. He wants us to embrace reality. And so he says, be careful of getting drunk, because getting drunk is really all about escaping reality. He wants us to embrace it. He wants us to acknowledge what is going on around us. He says, "Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man." When we are in a time of fear, our tendency, when we are gripped with fear, our tendency is to become self-protective. It's to be guarded. It's to push people away. It's to protect our resources. We have a tendency to be very careful about where we go and who we talk to. The reason why xenophobia is such a problem in South Africa is because as people are being fearful of newcomers, they're becoming very guarded and very self-protective. And what Jesus is saying is, it is in these times when there is so much stuff going on that is fearful, it is in these times that we need to stand. He says, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads because your redemption is drawing near. If we are living in a time of fear, Jesus says, now is the time to be doing the things that I've told you to do. It is now the time that Christians are to reach out in love. This is not the time for us to become self-protective. This is the time for us to be generous, to be forgiving, to be loving, to be hospitable. It is not the time for us to cower in fear. It is the time for us to stand up, to raise our heads, trusting that our redemption is near. So the question is, who are we? Who is First United Methodist Church, Pasadena? Who are we? Are we the ones who cower in fear, or are we the ones who stand up and lift our heads, trusting that our redemption is near? In the 1970s, we were still in a time in our history when we were very fearful of communism. Communism was the big threat. Starting right after World War II, probably even before that, we were very fearful of communism. Communism was our big enemy. I remember even in the 80s that one of the things that we had to do is we had to do these nuclear war drills where we would have to get under our desk because apparently school desks are impervious to nuclear war. It was a scary time back then, and we were so afraid of communism. And in the midst of all of that, we were fighting wars. We were fighting little things that were kind of kept secret in different places in Latin America, and we were fighting communism in Vietnam. We were fighting against communism there. And what happened was that when we pulled out of Vietnam, we opened our doors to the Vietnamese who were wanting a better life. In fact, I learned that this church at that time reached out and embraced a family of Vietnamese. We actually rented out a house. We set it up. We invited this Vietnamese family to live in that house until they could get their feet on the ground. One of our church members, who is still with us and a wonderful person, she was on staff at the time. Her name is Betty Jackson. Betty was so instrumental in getting that family set up that they named their daughter after her. They named their daughter Betty. We were a church that in the midst of so much fear decided not to cower back and be self-protective, but instead we stood up, we lifted our heads, trusting that our redemption is near, and we reached out to people who looked just like our enemies, and we said, for the love of Christ, we will embrace you. Are we still that church? Is that who we are? Who are we? Do we trust that redemption is near? Amen.